Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. So let's start. I step into the house late Sunday night after being out of town for the weekend. "Honey, I'm home," I called out, expecting to hear a familiar voice greet me back. Nothing. The silence in the house fell off. I walked through each room, bedroom, bathroom, backyard, his study, but found no trace of him. Oddly enough, the only light on was in the living room. The rest of the house sat in darkness. Heading out to the garage, I spotted his car parked where he always left it. Weird, I thought, shrugging it off as I went inside to grab a quick snack. By 10 that night, I was getting worried. I tried calling him again. Still no answer. It had been the same story all weekend. Nothing on Saturday night, nothing Sunday morning. Finally, just past midnight, I gave in and called the police. The officer on duty told me they couldn't do anything until someone had been missing for at least 24 hours. Frustrated and exhausted, I tossed and turned all night. This wasn't like him at all. He was predictable, reliable, someone you could set your watch by. Come morning, I decided not to head into work. Instead, I waited until 8 a.m. and called the police again. This time, they connected me to someone who promised they'd send officers over within a couple of hours. While I waited, I kept dialing his number, hoping for something, anything. Just before 10, the doorbell rang. 2 uniformed officers stood there. I let them in and shared everything I knew. One of them, the senior-looking guy, leaned forward and said, "Ma'am, we look for a few key signs in cases like this. It helps us figure out whether someone left on their own or if something more serious is going on." They started asking practical questions. Where does he keep his car keys, phone, wallet, and passport? I showed them his car keys, still hanging on their usual hook, and walked them to the garage to see his car. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Then I opened the safe to show them his passport and led them to his nightstand. That's when my stomach sank. His wallet was still there. Where could he have gone without his wallet? I muttered more to myself than to them. Before I could panic any further, the officer started firing questions. The second officer stood back, observing. "So, tell us about your husband, Mrs. Wilson. Where does he work?" "We own a company together, Clearview Industries." "Ever heard of it?" The officer gave a nod. "And what's his role?" "He's the CEO. I help out with the admin, bookkeeping, scheduling, that kind of stuff." "Must be doing well for yourselves," he commented with a knowing look. I gave a small nod. "We do okay." "And you're saying this behavior is completely out of character for him? He's never disappeared like this before?" "Never. Nathan is the type of guy who sticks to a routine like clockwork. It's one of the things I love about him." The officer leaned in a little closer. "And how would you describe your marriage, Mrs. Wilson?" I shot him a sharp look. "What are you trying to say?" "Just wondering if he was happy at home. Is it possible he ran off with, say, a secretary or someone?" I laughed, short and bitter. "First of all, I am his secretary. And second, Nathan would never do anything like that. He's completely devoted to me." The officer didn't look convinced, but he nodded along anyway. "Okay, so, can I ask where you were this weekend?" "I went to visit my sister in Greenfield. Left Friday night and got back Sunday around 7. "You drove?" "Yeah, it's only a 3-hour trip." The officer seemed satisfied for the moment. "All right, Mrs. Wilson, that's all I've got for now. Could you provide your husband's cell number, his bank details, personal and business, and any credit card accounts? Oh, and a list of friends and family members we might want to contact." I frowned. "Why do you need all that financial info?" "Well, if he left his wallet behind, he'll need money from somewhere. It could help us track him." I handed over the details, and they thanked me before heading out. "We'll keep you updated. And if you hear from him, call us right away." Of course, I promised. Once outside, the senior officer glanced at his partner. "Something's fishy about this." The younger one raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Didn't you see how defensive she got when we asked about their marriage? And she stumbled when we asked where she was over the weekend. I think we need to fast-track this one." "Think her sister's number is on that list?" "Yeah, that's where we'll start. I say we push this case to the top of the list." The senior officer muttered to his partner as they sat in the patrol car. "Something smells off here. Did she give us her sister's phone number on that contact list? Because that's exactly where we need to start." After the initial visit from the police, Rachel spent the rest of the day in a haze. The house felt too quiet, the ticking of the wall clock almost unbearable. She kept glancing at her phone, hoping Nathan would call, even though deep down, she knew he wouldn't. By late afternoon, her nerves were frayed. She decided to head to the office. Work might distract her, she thought. But as soon as she walked in, she felt the weight of Nathan's absence. His chair sat empty, his desk untouched. Everything about the space screamed routine, yet nothing felt normal. The receptionist, Amy, gave her a sympathetic look. Still no word from Mr. Wilson? Rachel shook her head. No, I'm sure he'll turn up. Amy nodded slowly, but there was doubt in her eyes. If you need anything, let me know. Rachel forced a smile and walked into her own office, closing the door behind her. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. Her mind wandered to the police visit that morning. Something about the way the detective had spoken bothered her. His questions had been pointed, deliberate, and Rachel had the nagging feeling he already suspected more than he was letting on. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Adam. Adam Thompson, we need to talk. Now. Rachel's heart sank. She knew what this was about. Adam was panicking. He hated uncertainty, and Nathan's disappearance had thrown a wrench into whatever plans he had been scheming. She took a deep breath and texted back, Rachel Wilson, not now. Later, moments after she sent the text, there was a knock at her office door. Amy peeked in, looking hesitant. Mrs. Wilson? There's a Detective Briggs here to see you. Rachel's pulse quickened. Send him in. The detective entered, his expression calm but serious. Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry to bother you again. I wanted to follow up on a few things. Rachel gestured for him to sit. Of course. How can I help? Briggs pulled out a notebook and flipped through it. We've spoken to a few of Nathan's colleagues and friends, and I wanted to clarify something. You mentioned that he's never gone missing before? Is that correct? That's right, Rachel said, keeping her tone steady. Nathan is a man of routine. Briggs nodded. And you said your marriage was stable? No issues. Rachel bristled slightly. We had a strong marriage. We built this company together. We were partners. Briggs's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he scribbled something in his notebook. One more thing. Do you know of anyone who might have a reason to harm your husband? Any business rivals? Personal enemies? Rachel shook her head. No. Nathan was well-liked. Briggs leaned back in his chair. What about Adam Thompson? The name hung in the air like a dagger. Rachel's stomach twisted. Adam? He's Nathan's deputy. Why? Briggs tapped his pen against his notebook. We've learned that Mr. Thompson was in charge of several recent financial transactions. He had access to all of your company's accounts, correct? Rachel nodded slowly. Yes, he's the CFO. Briggs's expression didn't change. And how would you describe your relationship with him? Rachel swallowed hard. Professional. Briggs's lips pressed into a thin line. I see. He stood up, slipping his notebook into his pocket. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Wilson. If you think of anything else, please give me a call. As soon as he left, Rachel let out a shaky breath. Her mind raced. How much did they know? How much did they suspect? That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made her jump. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the curtains. Everything felt ominous. Around midnight, she got up and went into the kitchen. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Adam. Adam Thompson, I'm serious, Rachel. We need to talk. I think they know. Rachel stared at the message for a long time before replying. Rachel Wilson, meet me tomorrow. Same place. Noon. The next day, Rachel arrived at their usual hotel. Adam was already there, pacing nervously in the lobby. When he saw her, he rushed over. We're in trouble, he said, his voice low and urgent. The police are sniffing around. They asked me about the accounts. They know about the transfers. Rachel's heart sank. How much do they know? Adam ran a hand through his hair. Enough. They're digging through everything. And now Nathan's missing. It looks bad. Rachel clenched her jaw. What are you saying, Adam? I'm saying we need to be careful. If they find out about us... Rachel cut him off. They won't. We've been discreet. Adam grabbed her arm. Rachel, this isn't a game. If they connect us to the money, we're screwed. Rachel pulled away. I know that. Adam sighed, rubbing his temples. I told you we should have moved the money sooner. Now it's too late. Rachel shot him a glare. You think this is my fault? I think we both took risks. And now we're paying for them, Adam replied. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. We'll figure it out. We have to. Adam nodded, but the tension between them was palpable. As they parted ways, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. And deep down, she feared that someone, maybe Nathan, was pulling the strings from the shadows. It didn't take long for 2 days to pass, but there was still no sign of Nathan. Rachel was spiraling. Her anxiety grew so intense that she called the police twice a day, every day, desperate for an update. But there was never any news. By Wednesday morning, those same 2 officers from before walked into her office unannounced. Rachel knew this couldn't be good. She led them to Nathan's office, closing the door behind them to give them privacy. This time, it was the older, more seasoned cop who took the lead. Mrs. Wilson, he started, his voice calm but firm. On Monday, you told us that you spent the weekend with your sister in Greenfield. Is that right? Rachel nodded. Yes, that's what I said. The officer's expression didn't change. Would you care to explain why you lied to us? Rachel froze. Her breath hitched. She hadn't expected them to catch her in the lie so soon. The story about visiting her sister had rolled off her tongue out of pure habit. She wasn't a natural liar. At least she hadn't been until about a year ago. But since then, hiding the truth had become almost second nature. She swallowed hard. I didn't want Nathan to find out, she whispered, barely audible. Find out what, Mrs. Wilson? The officer pressed. That I wasn't with my sister, Rachel admitted, lowering her eyes to the floor. The officer's tone sharpened. So, where were you? Rachel hesitated before answering. At the Hilton, the one across town. Were you alone? The officer asked, leaning in slightly. No, she whispered. Who were you with? He asked, keeping his tone neutral but firm. Rachel bit her lip, refusing to answer. She couldn't bring herself to say it. The officer raised a brow. It's your call, Mrs. Wilson. Either you tell us now, or we'll take you down to the station and have this conversation there. Her head snapped up. What? Arrest me? For what? Well, the officer said slowly, let's look at it from our perspective. Your husband has vanished, and all the signs suggest foul play. There are additional factors that I won't get into just yet. But believe me, we have more than enough to hold you. So, I'll ask again. Who were you with at the Hilton all weekend? Her shoulders slumped. There was no getting out of this now. A man, she admitted quietly. The officer exchanged a triumphant glance with his partner before turning back to her. And the man's name? She swallowed hard. Adam Thompson, she finally said. Your lover? The officer asked bluntly. Rachel gave a small, miserable nod. Yes. The officer's questions kept coming. Did you leave the hotel at any point between Friday night and Sunday evening? No, Rachel Blythe. The only time I left the room was to grab food at the restaurant. And what about Mr. Thompson? The officer asked. Did he stay in the room the entire time? Rachel shook her head. No. He stepped out for a couple of hours on Saturday afternoon. Said he had some personal business to take care of. The officer jotted down notes, then asked, And where can we find Mr. Thompson? Rachel's hands trembled slightly. She knew this was spiraling out of her control. He's across the hall, she said softly. He's Nathan's deputy CEO. The officer's face twisted with a hint of disgust. Let me get this straight, Mrs. Wilson. Your husband's right-hand man is also your lover? Rachel nodded silently. Is it possible your husband found out about the affair and decided to disappear? The officer asked. No. We were discreet, she insisted. Nathan would never have known. The officer stood up, adjusting his belt. Can you ask Mr. Thompson to come in here, please? Then leave us alone with him. Without a word, Rachel stood and walked to Adam's office. She poked her head inside. Adam, the police want to talk to you. They know about us. Adam's face paled instantly. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Slowly, he rose from his chair, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Without another word, he followed her into Nathan's office. Rachel sank into a chair in the reception area, heart pounding. For the next 45 minutes, She sat there in a haze of dread. Her mind kept circling back to her affair with Adam. She'd pushed it to the back of her mind for so long, compartmentalizing it as something separate from her real life. But now, the walls of that compartment were collapsing. She thought about how it had all started. The boredom had been overwhelming. Being with the same man for so many years had turned predictable, stale. Nathan had stopped trying to bring excitement into their marriage ages ago, and their love life had grown dull. When Adam made it clear he wanted something more than a professional relationship, Rachel had barely hesitated. It was like a breath of fresh air, something thrilling and forbidden. The guilt had been minimal at first, buried under the excitement of something new. But there had been one moment, about 4 months into their affair, that still haunted her. Adam had suggested something bold, something Rachel had never done before. The suggestion had triggered a memory of Nathan making the same request years ago. Back then, she had flat out refused, thinking it was too wild for her. The realization hit her. Maybe she was part of the reason their marriage had become so mundane. But instead of dealing with that, she had chosen to seek excitement elsewhere. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. None of that mattered now. Things were unraveling fast, and she had no idea how to stop it. She had a sudden flashback to Nathan suggesting the exact same thing years ago, using almost the same words. Of course, she had rejected him back then, thinking it was far too daring for her tastes. For a moment, a vague thought crept into her mind. Maybe she was partly to blame for how routine their relationship had become. But that thought was quickly pushed aside by the thrill of something new. The excitement buried any lingering guilt. Their secret weekend hadn't ended well. On Friday night, Adam suggested they both divorce their spouses and marry each other. Rachel shot the idea down immediately. Leaving Nathan was never on the table for her. But Adam brought it up again on Saturday, and things got heated. The argument escalated until words were said that made her suspect Adam had more on his mind than love. Perhaps he had his eye on her half of the company. Rachel instinctively knew not to tell the police the real reason Adam had disappeared for 2 hours on Saturday. He'd stormed out after their fight. Yes, he came back later, and yes, they made love again, but she knew the affair was headed for disaster. She had already started the process of emotionally detaching from him. It had to be done carefully. Any sudden changes might tip Nathan off. After the police left her house that afternoon, she and Adam stayed at the office, talking things over until late. They discussed all the possible consequences of Nathan's disappearance. By 6 p.m., they left separately, Rachel to her eerily quiet house, and Adam back to his wife. Sleep eluded them both that night. The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., a loud knock on Rachel's front door startled her awake. She groggily opened it to find a man in a suit flashing his badge, with 2 uniformed officers and 2 men in disposable coveralls standing behind him. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Detective Daniel Briggs. We have a warrant to search both your house and your business premises," he said in a calm but authoritative voice. "We'll need your computer login details, as well as your husband's if you have them." Rachel blinked, still in a fog of confusion. "Am I a suspect?" she asked quietly. "No, ma'am. We're simply looking for any clues that might help us find your husband," the detective explained. Still in shock, Rachel complied. She wrote down the requested passwords on a slip of paper and handed over the office keys. Then, as the small army of officers and technicians moved through her house, she stepped into the kitchen to make a call. She tried Adam's cell. No answer. Frustrated, she dialed his landline. Andrea answered. Rachel hated hearing Andrea's voice. The woman was stunning. Short blonde hair, flawless skin, striking blue eyes. With her 5 feet 2 inches frame and model-like features, she exuded grace and beauty. Andrea had always made Rachel feel plain in comparison. And the worst part? Andrea was sweet, kind, and fiercely loyal. The kind of woman who would never betray her husband. "Rachel." Andrea's voice sounded tense. "Do you know why there are 6 police officers stomping all over my house?" "No clue," Rachel replied, trying to sound casual. "They're here too. It must be about Nathan's disappearance." Andrea gasped. "Nathan's missing? Adam didn't say a word. What does this have to do with us?" Rachel rubbed her temple. "I'm not sure. Can I talk to Adam?" He's tied up with the police right now, Andrea said, her voice laced with concern. Rachel, what's really going on? I don't know, Andrea. I've got to go. Rachel hung up before Andrea could press further. As she set the phone back on its cradle, she noticed one of the technicians on his hands and knees, shining a strange-looking flashlight across the kitchen floor. Another one was rummaging through Nathan's car. Feeling cornered, she made her way to her own car, but a technician stopped her at the door. Not yet, ma'am. We haven't cleared that vehicle. With nowhere to go, Rachel retreated to her den and put on some calming music. It didn't help. Her mind was racing. The officers finally left around 2 p.m., offering no reassurance before they left. Rachel grabbed Nathan's car keys and decided to head to the office. No one had explicitly told her she couldn't use his car. The office was in disarray. Police had left a mess in reception and both Nathan's and Adam's offices. Adam was already there, pacing nervously. When he saw her, they exchanged quiet words of comfort, their recent tension forgotten in their shared fear. When Adam tried to pull her into a hug, Rachel gently pushed him back. We can't, she whispered. Not here. Not now. He nodded solemnly, understanding. They managed to keep their distance throughout the week, both emotionally and physically. But by the weekend, Rachel's resolve crumbled. Desperate, scared, and utterly alone, she called Adam. Rachel called Adam, and they met at their usual hotel for a brief meeting. When he tried to touch her more intimately, she angrily pushed him away, but allowed a friendly cuddle instead. The entire encounter left her feeling worse. It was clear that Adam was falling apart. He even broke down and cried. Seeing him like that lifted a fog in Rachel's mind. For the first time, she questioned everything. Had she really risked her stable marriage and her sweet, reliable husband for this man? This coward? An hour later, she made her decision. No, absolutely not. That's when guilt and regret truly hit her hard. She cried herself to sleep on Saturday and Sunday nights, barely catching a wink of rest. Two thoughts plagued her mind. First, she believed Nathan had discovered the affair and harmed himself. Second, the guilt that she had been hiding for months now burst through with full force. When Rachel came to the office, Adam was already there, pacing nervously. They exchanged a few quiet words of comfort, both of them terrified of what was coming next. When Adam reached out to hug her, Rachel stepped back. No, she said firmly. Not here. Not now. Adam nodded, understanding. They managed to keep their distance for the rest of the week. But by the weekend, Rachel couldn't hold it in anymore. Desperate and scared, she called Adam, and they agreed to meet again. The short drive to the police station that morning was completely silent. Rachel sat stiffly in the back of Briggs's car, lost in thought. When they arrived at the station, she spotted Adam being led inside by two officers. Her stomach twisted with dread. Briggs guided her into a small interview room, where they were joined by a female detective who didn't introduce herself. Once they were all seated, Briggs started the questioning. I want to make sure you're aware that this conversation is being recorded, he said. Can you state for the record that you agree to that? Yes, I agree, Rachel replied softly. And can you confirm that you've chosen not to have legal representation? Yes, that's correct, she answered. Briggs nodded and glanced at his notes. Mrs. Wilson, we've been monitoring your husband's bank and credit card accounts for the past week. There's been absolutely no activity since Saturday morning. Rachel frowned. What about his phone? Has there been any activity there? We'll get to that, Briggs said. Let's go back to the beginning. Last Monday, two officers visited your home when you reported your husband missing. Is that correct? Yes, Rachel confirmed. During that visit, you told them you had spent the weekend visiting your sister. But further investigation revealed that wasn't true. Mrs. Wilson, I have to be honest. We suspect that your husband is dead, Detective Briggs said, his tone grave. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. No, that can't be, she whispered, shaking her head. Briggs continued, unflinching. Look at the evidence. There's been no activity on any of Nathan's bank accounts, credit cards, or financial records. We know he hasn't left the country. His passport is still here. Rachel opened her mouth to explain that Nathan had dual citizenship and held a second passport, but Briggs cut her off before she could regain her footing. He wasn't about to let her take control of the conversation. You asked about his cell phone earlier, Briggs said, his voice steady. With the cooperation of his service provider, we located it in a dumpster about a block from your office last Tuesday. Along with the phone, we found a roll of plastic sheeting. Both the phone and the plastic had traces of blood that matches your husband's type. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. Her skin went pale as the weight of his words sank in. If something had happened to Nathan, she would be utterly shattered. But the detectives misread her horror, assuming it was guilt rather than grief. Do you have anything to say, Mrs. Wilson? Briggs asked. No, Rachel replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Briggs was a new breed of investigator, a product of modern police recruiting strategies. Ruggedly handsome, he had a disarming demeanor that put people at ease. But underneath that charm lay a razor-sharp mind. His background? Well, let's just say the police knew him before they hired him. His unique combination of intelligence, street smarts, and insight into criminal behavior had earned him a rapid rise through the ranks. He was the type to keep suspects off balance, and he wasn't done with Rachel yet. Briggs pressed on, keeping his tone calm but relentless. Maybe you can explain why we found a large bloodstain on your kitchen floor, also confirmed to match your husband's blood type. Rachel couldn't look at him. She stared at the floor, shaking her head slowly, unable to form a coherent response. For the record, Briggs said, turning toward the recording device on the table, Rachel Wilson is shaking her head. He mixed things up to throw her further off balance. Mrs. Wilson, would you care to comment on the prenuptial agreement we found in your home safe? The one that states all assets from your marriage go to the offended party in the event of proven infidelity. Rachel's head continued to shake. Words failed her. For the record, Briggs added, the suspect is shaking her head. Briggs leaned forward, his gaze never wavering. Are you aware, Mrs. Wilson, that during our search of Mr. Thompson's residence, we found a fishing knife? It had been cleaned, but forensic tests revealed traces of human blood. That blood type matches your husband's. Rachel continued to sit in silence, her gaze locked on the floor. Her head shook again, but she said nothing. Briggs delivered the final blow. Lastly, Mrs. Wilson, can you explain why we found blood matching your husband's type in the trunk of your car? A car that, according to your own statement, was parked at the Hilton Hotel from Friday night to Sunday night. The blood found in the trunk of Rachel's car had been tested, and results indicated it was spilled sometime on Saturday evening, give or take 12 hours. The weight of her situation finally began to sink in. A deadly certainty gripped her chest. For 5 long minutes, she sat in silence, staring at the floor, while the detectives patiently waited. They seemed more than willing to give her time to process the gravity of what they just said. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. I need a lawyer, she said softly. Briggs nodded without hesitation. Rachel Wilson, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Nathan Wilson. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say. Before he could finish, Rachel's world spun. Everything faded to black as she fainted in her chair. She was held overnight at the station. The next morning, at precisely 11 a.m., a judge set her bail at $250,000 and ordered her to surrender her passport. Rachel, hollow-eyed and barely functioning, accessed a loan account and transferred the funds to cover the bond. She caught a cab home that evening, a broken version of the confident woman she had been just 8 days earlier. Once, she had everything: a stable marriage, a successful business, a comfortable life. Now, all of it was crumbling before her eyes. As she sat alone in her kitchen, Rachel faced a truth that was harder to accept than anything else. Nathan was dead. But what really tore her apart was the thought that she had caused it. The guilt weighed on her chest like a boulder. She tried to recall happier memories of Nathan, his smile, his laugh, but instead, her mind replayed a different image. She saw him lying on the kitchen floor, his life draining away. She saw his face, wrapped in plastic, staring back at her as the trunk closed shut. The thought gnawed at her, consuming whatever shred of her soul remained. Sitting in a daze, she barely registered the ringing phone. Automatically, she answered it. Rachel. Adam's panicked voice came through the line. You got to help me. I called Andrea. She's gone. She cleared out our bank accounts and left me with nothing. Rachel closed her eyes, her exhaustion palpable. You need me to bail you out? Please, Adam begged. She sighed, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Okay, Adam. She went back online, pulled up her loan account, and transferred another $250,000 to cover his bond. Using her newfound knowledge of their financial accounts, she was able to make the payment quickly. The next day, just before lunchtime, Adam called again. Thanks, babe. I'm out, he said, his voice tired but relieved. Can I come see you? I really need a hug right now. Rachel didn't hesitate. Okay, Adam. See you soon. About an hour later, she heard a cab pull up outside her house. She stood slowly, her limbs heavy with fatigue, and made her way to the front door. When she opened it, whatever tiny thread of sanity she had left snapped. Standing on her porch was Adam Thompson, and in her eyes, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a monster. You lying, murdering bastard, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You killed my Nathan. In one smooth motion, she raised Nathan's pistol, which she'd found in the bedroom safe, and aimed it at Adam's chest. She didn't see the shock on his face as she pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood, and Adam was thrown backward, a .45 caliber bullet punching a hole clean through his chest. He crumpled to the ground so quickly that the second shot missed, sailing over his head. But the remaining 6 bullets didn't. Each one hit its mark, thudding into his twitching body as he lay sprawled on the walkway, the gun still clutched in Rachel's shaking hands. Her shoulders slumped, and she sat on the top step, leaning back against the doorframe. Whatever part of her soul was left slipped away in that moment. The spirit of Rachel Wilson fled. A few days later, Ruth pulled up to her sister's house. She had come prepared for a grim task, sorting through Rachel's affairs. As she walked up the driveway, she noticed a pile of mail in the box. She grabbed it, mostly bills and advertisements, but one item caught her attention. It was a postcard. The front showed a beautiful beach scene from Grand Cayman. Curious, Ruth turned it over and read the simple message scrawled on the back. Wish you and Adam were here. Love, D. Her heart skipped a beat. What the? She whispered, confusion washing over her. Still clutching the postcard, Ruth walked inside, her mind racing with questions. Ruth couldn't shake the unsettling message on the postcard. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. It sent a chill down her spine, reminding her of Nathan's casual, looping script. But that wasn't possible. Nathan was dead, wasn't he? Determined to find answers, Ruth began combing through Rachel's house. It was eerie being there, knowing her sister wouldn't be coming back. The rooms were unnervingly quiet, filled with memories of better days. Family holidays, birthdays, laughter echoing through the halls. But now, the silence felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. In the den, Ruth stumbled upon Rachel's laptop. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Surprisingly, there was no password required. The screen lit up, revealing an email inbox. One subject line immediately caught her attention. Final transfer confirmed, Cayman Trust. Her heart pounded as she clicked it open. The email was from a private offshore bank, confirming a massive transfer to an account in Nathan's name. Ruth's eyes widened as she read the details. The date of the transfer was the Friday before Nathan's disappearance. What the hell is going on? She whispered, her mind racing. Nathan hadn't been robbed. He hadn't been murdered for money. He had taken the money himself, or someone had done it on his behalf. The postcards suddenly made more sense. Was he alive? And if so, why had he left? Ruth's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a name on the screen that made her blood run cold. Andrea Thompson. With trembling hands, she answered. Hello, Ruth. Andrea's voice came through, tense and strained. We need to talk. Ruth met Andrea at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The two women sat across from each other, both looking exhausted and haunted by the events of the past week. I know what you found, Andrea said, cutting to the chase. The offshore account. Ruth's eyes narrowed. How do you know about that? Andrea leaned forward. Because I've been tracking Adam's movements for months. I knew he was up to something. I just never thought it would go this far. What do you mean? Ruth asked. Andrea took a deep breath. Adam and Rachel. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning something bigger. Adam convinced Rachel to move money out of the business accounts and funnel it offshore. He told her it was to protect their future together. But I think it was more than that. Ruth frowned. Are you saying Rachel knew about the money? Andrea nodded. At least part of it. But here's the thing, I don't think Rachel knew the full plan. I think Adam was playing her. He was planning to take the money and disappear. Ruth's heart pounded. And what about Nathan? Where does he fit into all of this? Andrea's expression darkened. That's the part one don't understand. But I can tell you one thing. Nathan isn't dead. Ruth froze. What? Andrea nodded slowly. The police told us they found Nathan's blood on the plastic sheeting and in the car, but it wasn't enough to indicate a fatal injury. It was staged. I think Nathan found out about the affair and the money, and instead of confronting them, he outplayed them. But why? Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Andrea leaned in, her voice cold. Revenge. Later that night, Ruth sat in her car outside Rachel's house, staring at the postcard in her hand. Her mind spun with possibilities. Could Nathan really be alive? And if so, why hadn't he contacted anyone? Why send a cryptic message instead? Her thoughts were interrupted by movement in the shadows. A figure was approaching the house, moving stealthily through the darkness. Ruth's heart leapt into her throat. She watched as the figure approached the front door, pulled out a key, and unlocked it. She recognized that walk, that posture. It was Nathan. Without thinking, Ruth jumped out of the car and ran toward him. Nathan, she called out. The man turned, startled. His face was partially hidden by the shadows, but there was no mistaking him. Ruth, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. She stopped in her tracks, trembling. You're alive. All this time, you've been alive. Nathan stepped closer, his expression weary. I had to disappear. Why? Ruth demanded. Why put everyone through this? Rachel, she thought you were dead. She's destroyed. Nathan's eyes hardened. Rachel made her choices. She betrayed me, took everything we built, and threw it away for Adam Thompson. I wanted her to suffer. But why not just leave? Ruth pressed. Why fake your death? Nathan's jaw tightened. Because leaving wasn't enough. I needed them to feel the loss, to live with the guilt. And now it's time to finish what I started. What do you mean? Ruth asked, fear creeping into her voice. Nathan's gaze was cold as ice. I've come back for the rest of what's mine. The next day, Rachel sat in her kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. She hadn't slept. The events of the past week played over and over in her mind. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood slowly, her heart racing. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Nathan, she whispered. He stood there, alive and very real. Hello, Rachel, he said, stepping inside. Rachel stumbled backward, her hands trembling. I thought you were dead. That was the idea, Nathan said coldly. But I'm not. And now we need to talk. Rachel's mind raced. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't you? Nathan cut her off. You chose Adam. You chose to steal from me. You chose to betray everything we built. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. I was wrong. I was so wrong. But I never wanted you to die. Nathan's gaze softened for a moment. And yet, you helped destroy me. Rachel collapsed into a chair, sobbing. What happens now? Nathan stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. Now I take back what's mine, and you live with what you've done. Rachel looked up, her face pale. Nathan, please. But Nathan had already turned to leave. Goodbye, Rachel, he said as he walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.